Okay, welcome back everybody. So for this unit, Water and the West, we get to do a sort of half American history unit, half environmental engineering unit, which is cool. Okay, so first, we've seen this before, right? Our precipitation map of the United States. The minimum to be able to grow crops is something like 20 to 25 inches of rain. So everything that is west of about here, right, so-called 99th parallel, was considered historically to be the arid lands, right? You had folks on the East Coast, right? You had folks who went all the way over to the West Coast for the gold rush, and then all this stuff in between, basically everything west of the Mississippi River, all the way out to California, was considered to be, I don't know, in the minds of these people, like the Sahara Desert. They just imagine, you know, big, flat sand dunes or something. Something that was wrong was what they imagined, right? And yeah, this was relevant because you needed to be able to grow crops, right? Have a ton of people who are farmers, who are looking for land and to own property as a way of making a name for themselves and improving their conditions, right? And there was this dream that was alive for a long time in the minds of Americans in the East Coast that, you know, the West was this boundless frontier of free real estate, basically, where you could go, and embodying the spirit of Thomas Jefferson, you could work hard and be an independent farmer who didn't need any help from anybody, which, as we can see in a minute, just never existed in the first place. But that was the idea, right? And it's not something that was, you know, imposed backwards as like a historical narrative. It was very much a compelling idea which shaped the minds of folks at the time, right? That sort of mythology and superstition and misunderstanding about the U.S., along with economic forces, drive the events of this unit, right? So we have these colonies, right? And we've got wealthy property owners in the colonies who decide that, you know, the British Crown is getting in the way of them being able to trade how they see fit and do business. And these are most embodied by these sorts of two forces pulling in tension, right? Thomas Jefferson and the big agricultural plantation owners in the South, and Alexander Hamilton sort of embodying the merchant class and the bankers in the North, and industrial owners in the North, right? Each of them needed each other. You have big urban settlements up here, cities, who could not grow enough food on their own to provide for the huge number of people who lived there, and so they had to trade and get their food from elsewhere. At the same time, folks in the South could not manufacture their own goods on the homestead. They didn't have factories inside their houses, and farmers are, you know, sort of notoriously affected by sort of random chance of the weather, right? So in a good year, they bring in tons of harvest, and in a bad year, you know, nothing at all. And so they needed the financial system. They needed banks and bankers to be able to give them loans to smooth things out whenever they had a bad year, which would happen to everybody now and again, right? Sort of irony that despite the fact that these two had completely separate interests pulling away from each other, they needed each other. And despite this sort of contradictions and tensions, there was also the fact that in their minds, everything west of this line was more or less free real estate, right? All these tensions and contradictions and conflicts, which were stitched into the country at its founding, didn't necessarily have to be resolved right away, because there was this sort of, you know, release valve for all the steam, which was the fact that people could expand and get new land, right? And to be clear, would systematically exterminate native peoples along the way, using any means at their disposal in a completely ruthless fashion. And so they did, right? So this is the U.S. in 1776, right? It expands, so United States in 1773, going all the way out to the Mississippi River here, and including the Northwest Territory, so-called, right? Later on, you have Lewis and Clark and their Louisiana Purchase, which is this huge chunk of land. Later on, we have the Mexican-American War and other conflicts, right? And they expand eventually all the way out west, right? Now, just in our minds, right, time period-wise, we can go to this time that's sort of between these two. So it's after the Louisiana Purchase, but before Mexican-American War and the annexation of Texas. And it is splitting the difference between these two, something like 1827 to 1829. This happens, right? So there's this man, Joseph Smith Jr. of New York, who says that he was revealed to him these golden plates, which were shown to him by God, and he translates them and publishes his findings as the Book of Mormon. He and a bunch of his supporters move out west, right? Sort of following this idea that it was free real estate, and they go out to Illinois, right? Yeah. They move out to Illinois, which was part of the U.S. by this time, and run into conflict there and troubles. And to cut a long story short, some of his dissenters, people who didn't agree with him, started publishing things that he didn't like of a newspaper, and he goes and destroys their printing press and is put in prison, and then he is murdered in prison. And what happens after this? A person named Brigham Young takes his supporters and moves them out to the Great Salt Lake of Utah, right? Brigham Young pictured here, right? And to be clear, right, this is a big journey. So we're talking about Illinois all the way out to the Salt Lake of Utah here, and has this sort of divine moment of revelation and says, okay, you know, this is the land that God has chosen for us, and we're going to plant down roots here and we're going to make it work. But keep in mind, do you remember that precipitation map at the beginning where we said that, you know, everything west of about here, you didn't get enough rain to be able to grow crops? Well, Utah very much fell into that category, right? And so Brigham Young and all of his followers who came out there had to develop irrigation and reclamation to be able to farm and to be able to survive, right? And it's worth noting that this was, you know, extraordinary. This demanded incredible organization and selflessness on the part of the people who moved out there, right? Basically, any sort of less organized group of people, if they had tried to move to the middle of Utah on their own and start farming and irrigating, they would not have made it, right? It required just an incredible amount of social cohesion and centralized networking and power to be able to make it out here. And something like 30 years later, right, Salt Lake City begins to build up using this irrigation system, right? And it's only because of that cohesion and the fact that there was this strict hierarchy with people who could make collective decisions for them about how to do stuff with water, which doesn't obey political boundaries, that the city is able to survive, right? And with this comes this sort of idea, right? And this was a widespread idea, very common idea, not a niche thing, right? That rain follows the plow. In other words, that as the Mormon settlers got there to Utah, that as they began to develop the land and to plow it and to get it ready for farming, that some sort of divine force would cause there to be more rain in the area, right? So rain follows the plow. First, you go out and plow the area, and then rain follows. And as sort of laughable as that idea might sound to us today, it sort of governed water policy in this part of the world, the American West, for, I don't know, up until today, up until more than today, right? That you could make rain happen by going out there and starting the farm, right? Sort of embodying this do-it-all spirit, right? So you have this gradual movement, right? So people who are cramped in right on the East Coast where there's not a lot of land for themselves are brought out, not necessarily to Utah, right? Not necessarily as part of that group, which is eventually subsumed into larger federal government projects. But there is this whole movement of trying to take people who, you know, saw themselves in the spirit of the yeoman farmer, saw themselves in the spirit of the Southern independent agriculturalist on their own farm making it work, and move out west, and they were promised land by the government, right? And a lot of them failed along the way. They were essentially given plots of land that they could not make work, right? For a number of reasons, partially being that they were not part of some sort of larger structure that could provide for them. They were forced to go out there and make it on their own, and essentially given plots of land that were unfarmable. They just didn't get enough rain to be able to grow crops. They were given a deal where they could never win, no matter what they did. If you've ever heard of the Homestead Act, right, this would include it, right? Some people got plots of land that were like next to the river and were really good. Some people got plots of land that were impossible, and they tried to farm it until their last days and didn't succeed. Now, there are some people, including this person. So this is John Wesley Powell, the explorer. He was a Civil War veteran, actually lost, I think it was his right arm. It was blown off by a musket shot. So very energetic, one-armed dude going around and exploring the West, who tries to report back to Congress and, tell them, like, hey, this isn't going to work out here in the West, right? That there's problems with this. And that is essentially going to be our starting point for water in Arizona. And all the developments that come as a result was this man, John Moseley Powell, trying to get Congress to make sense of what Arizona actually looks like. And we'll leave it there.